Hey, remember way back when we talked about the idea of positionality? In 703, you may not remember that one of the first videos I think I recorded for your cohort was addressed positionality and this idea of positionality. It is a really interesting, I think, and important topic for us to tackle as social researchers. When you're doing research in social spaces, and education is social work, right? Social research, you have to really consider that your life, your identity, your beliefs, your experiences, your prejudices, your presumptions, all of those things are part of how the research is done and how it is analyzed and how it is delivered to the world. Positionality is something, however, that comes sometimes with a little bit of baggage. Historically, positionality was designed to offer people insight into identities or backgrounds that might be influential in some way, shape, or form to researchers and their findings. So, for example, if you are an educational researcher who is doing studies about ESL learners and their experiences in school. If you yourself was someone who came to school with an English language learning need, and you yourself had experiences in school that may have been negative with regards to your native language, with your issues with regards to the acquisition of English, then that is something that for you to acknowledge and say, I had these experiences. It both positions you as someone with a certain kind of personal stake in the conversation because your personal experience is something that may have led you to this work, but it also provides us with insight into what you know, right? It might bias you both in ways that we would consider to be positive or beneficial to your ability to do that analysis, right? I'm a researcher who studies teachers and teachers' work who was a teacher for 20 years. It would be foolish for me to suggest that my identity as a teacher does not impact the work that I do. It absolutely does. It both prejudices me, it makes me really think through the lens of a teacher. It makes me also call people out in conversations about the way they talk about teachers and teachers' work. But it also may lead me to have insights, and it may also enrich what I can say I know about this space, right? So in the work that I do around teachers' labor, in the way that these new expectations of teachers and their work impacts their ability to do their work, comes directly out of a personal experience, right? People will ask me, why did you start this work? And when I start that conversation, I go, not to a reading that I did, but to a student that I had, right? So that is rich. That is part of why I knew that there was richness in the space that I wanted to research. So positionality doesn't mean something negative. It can actually be harmful. And I'll tell you about that in a second, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. It doesn't necessarily mean anything good. It's merely an acknowledgement of a position or a background or a condition of your life that may be of interest to people who read your work. When I say harmful, what I mean is that positionality has sometimes been critiqued because the people who are asked to do positionality statements or who are expected to do positionality statements tend to be people who come from marginalized backgrounds or from communities that aren't typically expected to be people who are like doing research, right? So my example, I had a lot of times when I was a PhD student where my positionality as a teacher was not perceived to actually be a benefit, where there were people in scholarly spaces or elite academic spaces who, when I told them that I had 20 years of teaching experience before I came to academia, thought that that meant that I was biased, but also it meant that unlike those individuals who had no experience in teaching, because I had experience, I was expected to do the labor of stating it, of explaining it, of justifying my work and justifying my role in that work. The same was true for some of my colleagues, right? I have this incredible colleague. Her name is Dr. Paris Wicker. She teaches at the University of New York in Buffalo. And when I was in class with Paris is a woman of color, we were talking about positionality statements, and our professor, who himself was an older white man, had spent his entire career in academia, very well-established scholar, someone who had written enormous amounts. You can look him up. His name is Dr. Cliff Conrad. Enormous amounts about experiences of people of color at historically Black universities. And he made a comment about positionality in our class that Paris took a little bit of contention with. He said, well, I've never written a positionality statement. He said, I know everybody says you should write them, but he kind of said, I don't really think they matter. And Paris said, but Dr. Conrad, don't you think that's because you're a white man and you've never been asked to write one? She said, I'm a Black woman who writes about the experiences of Black women in higher education. And she said, I've been asked to write positionality statements for every major work that I've written. And Dr. Conrad responded really defensively. He did not like that she called that out. He felt very uncomfortable with it. But the reality of what Paris was saying is that that does tend to happen, just like with so many other things in our society. We are prejudiced by our sort of systemic and historic oppressions that have been layered onto people like Paris and people of color, people of indigenous backgrounds who are asked to sort of justify their position or explain why they're in the room. So I'm asking you to write a positionality statement as an exercise. You are going to add it to the beginning of your methods section or your methods chapter. It's just a paragraph. You'll see some of the examples that are on the module. But I think it's a good exercise, not only for us to think about our positionality and the political context in which positionality statements are written, but the other thing that I would argue is that when you are doing, and it's not just me making this argument, this is, something that's really a big part of qualitative work, is when you are going to do the kind of qualitative or empirical qualitative work that we're asking you to do or that you're taking up in your work, you checking in with yourself about the way that your life positions you to understand text and experiences is really important. And because qualitative work is about the margins, you're going to read Dr. Winkle Wagner's introduction to her book about this, and she talks about this looking to these margins, these places where we rarely look. You need to really check in with yourself. You need to really remember what your position on these things is. I need to remind myself I am a white cisgendered woman who was raised in public schools in a working class family in the rural Midwest. And all of those things mean that there are things that I will not hear the same as my colleague Paris, that I will not interpret in the same way. And so it doesn't mean that my work is invalid, but it means that I need to be in check with that so that as I do that analysis, I am ready to say, okay, I'm reading an interview transcript of a queer man in an urban environment, or an indigenous teacher who is teaching in, a small rural school in Canada. I am reading a transcript that someone told me their life experience. I need to make sure that I am aware of what my background is, what my position is as I come into that space. Because as I interpret that, all of the things that make me who I am, all of the experiences that I've had, and frankly, the light that I have not seen. It is not just what you know, but is what you don't know about other people's positions, other people's lives, that really has to be at the forefront of your mind as you do this work that looks to the margins, as you are becoming and developing those critical skills of understanding systemic injustice and the way it piles in. You also have to understand that research has been part of that harm. And researchers who are not aware of their own positionality, who are not attending to the limitations of their vision, have also historically been part of the harm that has been done to marginalized communities. So, asking you to create a positionality statement, asking you to look at the world and, through a critical lens is part of working towards repair of some of that, that harm that has been done in these spaces. Okay, so take a look at the positionality work that I've set before you, including starting to think about writing your positionality statement, understanding what's in a positionality statement, and doing some really deep thinking about your own position as you go into these analytic processes will be really, really important. Don't skimp on the readings. Don't skimp on this sort of critical self-analysis. It is what will repair the world, is if we all are doing this work together. If you are just asking others to do that kind of critical, insightful positionality work, then the steps we can take together to repair this kind of harm are much smaller than if you are taking brave, big, bold steps and doing this great work along the way. Okay, talk to you guys soon.